Imagine this. You are standing in the biting cold of a January wind. Your palm is pressed against a rampart of rammed earth, rough as sandpaper. You are the commander of the Empire's most elite frontier force. The order you have just received consists of 2 words. Hold fast. You turn your head and look east. You are scanning the horizon for the only supply line that matters. Now, ask yourself, if someone whispered in your ear that this single glance would stretch on for 42 years, that your entire remaining life would be consumed by a silence that never answers back, what would you feel? There are no grand ceremonies here. No oracles predicting the future. There is only you, the isolated city of Kucha behind you, and 20,000 soldiers who do not yet know their fate. You don't know it yet, but thousands of miles away, the Imperial Center has initiated a ruthless mechanism of damage control. To save the heart, they have decided to sever the limb, and you are the limb. Welcome to the autopsy table of history. We are not dissecting a myth of ancient loyalty. We are opening a cold case file, a case of imperial abandonment. The victim is a super enclave, a territory cut off from every artery, yet forcing itself to survive. We are going to trace how it managed a slow, agonizing death over half a century, defying the laws of political physics with absolutely no external energy source. The subject's name is Guo Xin. The time of the incident, the year 765. To understand why this trap was set, we must pull the camera back. Way back, look at the map of East Asia. It is convulsing. The civil war that nearly shattered the Tang Dynasty is technically over, but the internal bleeding is fatal. To stop the chaos, the central government became a frantic pumping machine. It sucked every drop of elite blood from the western frontiers to feed the meat grinder in the east. The 2 great pillars of defense, the Anxi and Biting protectorates, were stripped of their main armies. Strategically, this created a massive vacuum, and into this vacuum, the Tibetan Empire poured down from the high plateaus like a flood. They didn't just attack the cities, they were smarter than that. They surgically severed the Hexi corridor, the only artery connecting the imperial heart to the western limbs. When Guo Xin crossed into that corridor in 765 to take command of the 4 garrisons, he thought he was taking charge of an Iron Legion. But in our forensic view, this was a classic divestment of toxic assets. The moment Guo Xin stepped through the gates of Kucha, the iron trap shut behind him. The entire system of the military governor, a system built on money and legitimacy flowing from the capital, instantly failed. The chain of command broken. The flow of funds dried up. Even the flow of information became a black hole. Guo Xin did not inherit a province. He inherited a ticking time bomb. For the first 15 years, from 765 to 781, Guo Xin and his men existed in a state of suffocating radio silence. There are no official records of these years, but through logic and environmental evidence, we can reconstruct the brutality of their daily lives. Tens of thousands of professional killers, men used to receiving a salary, were forced to become farmers in the desert. They stripped off their shining armor and put on rough-spun cloth. They tilled the salty earth around the oasis. This was no longer just warfare. It was a battle against the laws of thermodynamics, an attempt to maintain energy in a sealed, dying system. In the excavation pits of Kucha, archaeologists found a critical piece of physical evidence, a coin. The Janzhong coin, look closely at this object. This is not the refined copper currency you see in museums of the capital. The edges are rough, filed down by hand. The metal has a sickly reddish hue, a sign of desperate metallurgy, an imbalance of lead and tin. The characters stamped on it are crooked. This coin is admissible evidence in our court. It proves that after the funding stopped, Guo Xin usurped a right reserved only for the emperor himself, the right to mint money. They likely melted down broken weapons, old statues, perhaps even the brass buckles from the dead, forcing this currency into existence in a crude desert workshop. This was not an act of rebellion. It was the opposite. It was a desperate attempt to keep the old operating system running. By forcing this rough money to circulate, Guo Xin bound the merchants, the civilians, and the soldiers together. He created a physical illusion that the great Tang order still existed. But in the year 781, this fragile equilibrium built on silence and inertia was broken. After 16 years of isolation, Guo Xin rolled the dice. He realized that the internal loop was failing. The defense systems were aging. So, he sent a suicide squad. They did not take the blocked corridor to the east. Instead, they went north, crossing the deadly deserts into the territory of the Uyghur Khaganate. They made a massive U-turn across the continent, traveling thousands of miles through hostile lands. Miraculously, they reached the capital, Chang'an. When these ragged, skeletal messengers stood in the Golden Hall, the capital went into shock. The new emperor, Dezong, wept openly on the throne, because on the government's casualty lists, the Western garrisons had been written off more than a decade ago. Everyone assumed they were dead, or that they had surrendered. This sounds like the climax of a Hollywood movie, doesn't it? The heroes return, the cavalry is coming. But under the cold lens of structural analysis, this was not a rescue. It was the accelerant for the tragedy. The empire did respond. Oh, they were generous. They sent titles. They sent promotions. Guo Xin was anointed the Prince of Wu Wei. His officers were given high ranks. For a moment, commissions stamped with a bright red imperial seal flew like snowflakes through the northern route to the west. But take this list of honors and place it under the microscope. You see the titles. You see the glory. But what is missing? Material aid. There were no reinforcements. Not a single soldier. There was no silver. There was no strategic plan to reopen the corridor. Why? Because the Central Empire was drowning in its own crises, mutinies, warlords, the emperor himself fleeing his capital to the empire. That distant, severed appendix in the west could only be fed with paper. Legitimacy that cost the treasury nothing. It was a cruel, asymmetrical exchange. Guo Xin traded 16 years of flesh and blood for a stack of political promissory notes that could never be cashed. And here is the fatal blow. These empty titles acted as a high-potency stimulant for Guo Xin and his men. It gave them a hallucination. It convinced a generation of aging soldiers that the empire had not forgotten them, that if they just held on a little longer, the legions would arrive tomorrow. This hope, endorsed by the highest power in the land, was more dangerous than despair. It locked Guo Xin's exit door. He could no longer act like a pragmatic warlord who might negotiate or flee. He was now a hostage to his own honor. He was nailed to a sand dune that was destined to collapse. Since the empire had kidnapped him with honor, Guo Xin had to play the second hand of this deadly game. To justify those magnificent titles, to buy this dying enclave one more breath of air, he turned his eyes to the only external lever left, the Uyghur Khaganate in the north. Make no mistake. This was not the foreign aid you read about in storybooks. This was a loan shark arrangement, high risk, purely transactional. The Uyghur horse lords only lent their cavalry because they needed the Anxi garrison as a nail to pin down the Tibetans on their own flank. Guo Xin knew the score. He had essentially mortgaged his life and the lives of his men to a greedy neighbor. For a brief moment, the leverage worked. Around the year 784, these isolated legions even launched a counterattack. It was the last flash of light before the bulb burned out. They charged into the desert, waving blades that no longer belonged to the empire, wearing patched uniforms, fighting for a government that had already filed their death certificates. But the laws of geopolitics are cold. When the cost of maintaining an ally exceeds their value, abandonment is the only rational choice. In the year 790, the noose finally tightened. The Tibetan Empire launched a total offensive. The Northern Protectorate fell. The Uyghurs ran the numbers, cut their losses, and withdrew. Then the Kingdom of Khotan fell. The network was shredded, the arteries were cauterized. Kucha was no longer a fortress. It was a solitary lifeboat floating in an ocean of enemies. From this moment on, the case enters its most chilling phase. Phase 3, the time freeze. Let us return to that piece of evidence, the Jinzhong coin. In the eyes of a forensic historian, this is a death report. In the capital of Chang'an, emperors died and new ones ascended. The era names, the very markers of time, changed from Jinzhong to Xingyuan, then to Zhenyuan. Each name change signaled a shift in the political climate, but inside the hermetically sealed capsule of Kucha, time had coagulated. Guo Xin and his men did not know the world had turned the page. So, on coins minted in the year 790, the year 800, even the year 805, they stubbornly, blindly stamped the characters Jinzhong. It wasn't nostalgia. It was the absolute physical severing of the information chain. They were like survivors in a submarine at the bottom of the trench, watching the oxygen gauge hit zero, yet still following the schedule from the day they launched. This date error is a rare scar in history. It records how a massive administrative organ, after its nervous system is severed, continues to twitch in the dark, driven only by muscle memory. The final 18 years for the people inside Kucha, this was not a siege. It was a slow-motion experiment in decay. Picture the ecology of the city. The soldiers were no longer young shock troops. They were old men with white hair. The second and third generations born inside the walls spoke a dialect of Chinese that was 40 years out of date. They had never seen the capital. Their entire universe was 4 crumbling walls and endless sand. It became a heavily armed nursing home, a closed system with no energy input, where entropy only increases. Every morning, Guo Xin woke up to a brutal subtraction problem. 1 less sack of grain in the silo, 1 more crack in the rampart, 1 less man strong enough to lift a spear. Finally, the clock ran out. The year is 808. We suspect the winter that year was exceptionally harsh in the Tarim Basin. The Tibetan army completed the final encirclement of Kucha. Delete the orchestral score from your head. Forget the cinematic last stand. Given the overwhelming gap in power and the biological decay of the defender, this was likely a low-decibel event, an administrative clearance. The Tibetan records barely mention it. To the High Plateau Empire, pulling out this rusty nail After 42 years was just a janitorial task, we can reconstruct the physics of the scene. When the walls were breached, there was likely very little noise. The defenders were too old to scream. Their throats had been sanded dry by decades of wind. The sound of rusty blades hitting rotten leather is dull. Thud, thud. Guo Xin, now a man in his 70s, perhaps 80, stood in the governor's office he had held for 40. 2 years around him lay his lieutenants, his friends, his family. The only family he had left. Then fire or a volley of arrows, and the mechanism stopped. After 808, the Western Protectorate vanished. The name Guo Xin, along with thousands of white-haired soldiers, evaporated from the surface of the earth. No tombstones, no bones. They dissolved into the shifting dunes of the Taklamakan. Now, step back from that bloody winter night. Return to the present. Stand with me at the autopsy table. When we place that crude, red, copper coin under the microscope, when you run your fingers over the eroded ruins of the Subash temple in Kucha, what are we really looking at? Traditional storytellers want to sell you a poem about loyalty, white hair in the wind, clutching the sword to the death. But through the lens of structure, this case is colder. It is a textbook example of the sunk cost fallacy and systemic abandonment. The Tang central government, facing an existential crisis, made a rational calculation. To save the core, the periphery was classified as acceptable loss. Guo Xin was the terminal operator of this system. He was locked into a structural dead end. The last order he received was hold. The machine gave the order, cut the power, and then forgot the machine even existed. He was a satellite left in orbit, fuel gone, drifting on inertia, circling in the dark round and round until gravity finally pulled him down to burn in the atmosphere. Today, if you stand on the Gobi Desert near Kucha, the silence is terrifying. The sun hits the yellow mounds of earth. It is blindingly bright. The wind blows through the holes in the broken walls. Woo, woo, that is all. There are no ghosts crying out, no anthems. The struggle that lasted 42 years left no scratch on the surface of the planet. Nature has covered the human noise with a blanket of permanent indifference. This absolute nothingness is the true color of history. It tells you this to the land. The rise and fall of empires, the sacrifice of individuals, the weeping of a garrison abandoned for half a century. It is all just dust, suspended for a second, then gone. Only that coin remains, sitting in a glass case in a museum, its crooked characters telling the wrong time, stubbornly proving that once, in a forgotten corner of the world, a group of men believed in a promise that didn't exist until the very end of time.